Good evening and welcome to the show. Well, 2 months ago, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers published an essay in the leftist monthly magazine outlining his vision for Australia in the wake of the third crisis to hit us in 15 years. The first crisis was the global financial crisis of 2008. The second was the self-inflicted COVID panic that started in 2020, and now the inflationary crisis that threatens many liberal economies. The first two crises had changed us, Chalmers said, and he asked, quote, "What could we learn that might guide us in 2023, unquote. By we and us, he doesn't mean you, he just means himself, his fellow Labor ministers and the people they appoint to influential positions. The jargon in Chalmers' essay conceals his true agenda: to redefine what values Australians, that means you, should embrace. Quote, "Now it's time for Democrats to understand that economic inclusion is fundamental to the health and democracies and the safety of nations. There will always be bad actors and bigots, but they will only find widespread public support if the political economy is failing the people. By failing to put the values at the forefront of how our economies work, we also leave behind reams of wasted talent, a degraded environment, and social dislocation," unquote. Since when did a treasurer need to worry about bigotry? I thought he just needed to balance the books. If Chalmers is as authoritarian as his essay makes him out to be, it's not at least through malice. He is a decent bloke, and he still lives in Logan, the outer Brisbane electorate where he grew up, and his intentions are good, to a point. He wants to find his political career as, quote, "from the suburbs, of the suburbs, and for the suburbs," unquote. That paraphrasing of Abraham Lincoln's line from the Gettysburg Address makes a telling mistake. Chalmers is of the suburbs, but he's not by the suburbs. In the essay, Chalmers says, quote, "Democracies will prevail if we rely on their inbuilt strengths," unquote. But the strengths that built democracy in Australia, such as individual freedom, economic choice, personal responsibility and a collective set of moral values, don't get a mention in his essay. Instead, Chalmers says we must devise, quote, again, "ethical and practical incentives for leaders to govern in ways that improve the lives of people," unquote. Well, to Chalmers, government is all about making decisions for other people because he knows what's good for them better than they do themselves. Yesterday, we saw the first major step in his plan to transform Australia away from its traditional strengths. It was the release of a report that will modernise the Reserve Bank of Australia and potentially pave the way for the government to decide how you spend your money based on how good you've been in its eyes. But first, let's go back to May 22 last year, the day after the election that made Chalmers the new federal treasurer. Chalmers suddenly realised that the promises they had been making until 24 hours earlier might not be so feasible. He told 9 newspapers, quote, "We want Treasury and Finance to go through the budget line by line. We want to separate the commitments that might be worthwhile and useful from those that might not," unquote.